how much do you know about State Department's plan and Taliban's talk?
Well, not nearly enough. Certainly since the talks fell apart, we've learned a lot more about what was contemplated in this agreement. I am concerned that the Afghan government is not playing a more active role with a seat at the table during these negotiations. Obviously, the Afghan government has been a key partner of ours, and they need to be part of this process. I think it's also important that women have a seat at the table in whatever negotiations go on, to make sure that women and girls are protected in whatever the ultimate resolution looks like. So, I think on the positive, these negotiations appear very serious, even though they've come to a halt. They got further than they've ever gotten in the past, and there's going to have to be a peaceful resolution to this conflict. But I would like to see, when they resume, the Afghan government with a direct role in those negotiations.
Mm-hmm. John Bolton opposed State Department plan to sign an Afghan peace agreement or deal with Taliban militia, saying that the leaders of Taliban cannot be trusted. Do you agree with his assessment?
Well, I certainly agree that I would not base this agreement or proposal on trusting the Taliban. I have very little trust in the Taliban. So I think whatever is agreed to, there have to be metrics to show the Taliban's continued commitment to whatever is pledged in terms of a peaceful resolution, a ceasefire, in terms of cracking down on any groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS that would continue the support of terror. So I think that any troop drawdown should be contingent on successful metrics. And I don't know yet what was in the agreement, whether it had such metrics or whether it was based on mere promises by the Taliban. But as loath as I am to agree with Mr. Bolton, and I have a great many differences with him, I certainly would concur that the agreement has to be based on more than an expectation of good faith by the Taliban, because there's been precious little demonstration of that.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Bolton believed that the United States could draw down to 8,600 troops in Afghanistan and continue with the counterterrorism without signing an agreement with Taliban. Do you think it was a good idea to pull back without a deal?
Well, as I understand the proposed agreement, there would be a drawdown of about 5,300, bringing us to about 8,000, in exchange for something, in exchange for a Taliban commitment to part company with Al-Qaeda, or take action against ISIS, and maybe a partial ceasefire. But I don't know, I'm speculating, because so much of this has been kept under wraps. But the presence of those troops is about the only leverage that we have. I don't think we should trade away that leverage without getting something tangible in return. And I think it's important for the Taliban to demonstrate that they have both the will to bring about a ceasefire, and that they have the capacity to bring about a ceasefire. That is, that they control their own elements, so that we're not agreeing with one group of Taliban and another group of Taliban continues to attack us and attack our Afghan allies.
Do you think this is the end of or the deal with Taliban, talks with Taliban, is dead for good?
I have to hope that it isn't the end, because at the end of the day, there's going to have to be a peaceful resolution of this. We've been at war for 18 years, and I don't think there's going to be a military triumph as long as both sides are committed to the fight. So there's going to have to be some negotiated outcome. And I think certainly that negotiation ultimately will have to be between the Afghan government and the Taliban. We will have to play an important facilitating role. And I think it's important in terms of our national security interest in the United States that we don't draw down merely on a hope and a prayer that Al-Qaeda doesn't reemerge or ISIS doesn't grow in strength, that the Taliban lives up to its word. There has to be more than hope involved in such an agreement.
Taliban on Tuesday, they vowed that they'll continue fighting against U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Taliban says that the United States will regret abandoning the negotiation. What do you think of this statement of Taliban?
Well, I think the Taliban is trying to increase its bargaining position by escalating the violence, by talking tough. Look, we've had 18 years of that. It hasn't been successful for the Taliban, although they do control large parts of the country. We've had our own period of talking tough, and Mike Pompeo said that we'd killed some thousands of Taliban in the last 10 days. But we're going to have to get back to a negotiating table at some point. I'm not sure that escalating violence on both sides is the best way to get back to the peace table.
Congressman, what really triggered President Trump to make this decision? He mentions that the U.S. soldier was killed, but throughout the 9 round of talks, there were at least 16 U.S. soldiers were killed. What really triggered it this time?
It's a good question, and I have no idea. As you say, there have been tragic casualties of U.S. forces, of our Afghan allies, all throughout this process. So that doesn't seem like a plausible explanation. The whole summit at Camp David to begin with, I think, was an ill-conceived idea. So I don't know why it was proposed, except the president wanted to be in the center of things. I don't know why it was canceled, but ultimately we're going to have to pick up the pieces and begin the dialogue again. But I hope that we do it a bit differently this time, and we make sure that the Afghan government is deeply involved. And there are certainly ways for that to happen, even in the absence of direct discussions initially between the Afghan government and the Taliban. They could still be round-robin discussions between the U.S. and the Afghan government and the U.S. and the Taliban, et cetera, until we can put both parties together in the same room. But it seems like the Afghan government has been left out of a lot. I do hope that as Afghanistan moves forward with the elections, that there will be a supreme effort to avoid infighting among Afghans in connection with that election. The last heavily contested election brought about a crisis. That crisis, if it were to recur after this election, would just inure to the Taliban's benefit. So I hope the political parties, as rough as this campaign has been, will seek an election outcome that the Afghan people can have confidence in.
Mm-hmm. What will be next for President Trump on the fate of Taliban? Do you think there will be a surge? Do you think that there will be more troops deployed to Afghanistan?
I don't think that there'll be more troops deployed to Afghanistan. And in terms of what the president will ultimately do, I don't know. He has a history of changing directions, and so he is unpredictable. But I would imagine that our negotiating teams will continue their engagement whenever that's allowed to resume. And ultimately, it's going to have to resume. That's the only way this is going to be resolved.
Congressman, do you support President Ghani's decision to hold the election?
Well, it's up to the Afghan people when to hold their elections. My priority is that there be, whenever the elections are conducted, that they be conducted honestly and fairly, and that they be conducted in such a manner as to give confidence to the result. Because it took Secretary Kerry a year of difficult negotiations to reach a resolution after the last heavily contested election, and we can't afford that at this critical time.
One question regarding Pakistan. Are you satisfied with Pakistan's cooperation with the peace process with Taliban? And What can Pakistan do now?
I have not been satisfied with Pakistan's action in terms of cracking down on the Taliban presence within Pakistan, or the degree to which Pakistan has given safe haven to the leadership of the Taliban. I think it's important to involve the regional players. Pakistan as well as India, Iran will have a voice as well, Russia, because they have the ability to, all these countries have the ability to muck up the peace. So it's important that they have a role and some buy-in to the ultimate resolution of the conflict. But there's a lot more that Pakistan, I think, can do to signal to the Taliban through its actions that it will not enjoy a safe haven there and that it needs to come to the table. I think had Pakistan been more willing to do so, we might have gotten to a successful resolution far before now.
President Ghani this week said that any kind of talk with Taliban without a complete ceasefire is impossible. Do you think a ceasefire would be a condition if talks will start again?
I think that it's very important to obtain a ceasefire to demonstrate that the Taliban are serious about peace and that they can control their own elements. So I think it's important in its own right, but also as a test of whether this is really a viable peace proposal. I think the Afghan government should have a role in negotiating what does this step-by-step process look like. The Taliban argument is that they can't give up all their leverage until they obtain their objective. That's an issue that will have to be the subject of negotiation. That is, will we get a complete ceasefire? Will there be a partial ceasefire, but then no guarantee of a troop pull down until there is a full ceasefire? Those are the elements of the negotiation, which I don't know what was in this proposed deal, but I do think that the Afghan government needs to have a voice in that negotiation.
How do you see the future of Afghan-United States relation?
Well, and to get back to your last point, this is why it's so important for women to have a seat at the table in negotiation. I'm not particularly confident that even if the Afghan government has a role in negotiating along with the United States and the Taliban, that women's rights and interests are going to be safeguarded if women aren't part of that negotiation. Afghan women need to be at the table as part of the Afghan government delegation in making these decisions. And then I'll have confidence that women and girls' rights are being respected. In terms of the future of U.S.-Afghan relations, I think that we have a now shared history of loss and sacrifice in the interest of peace in Afghanistan, in the interest of a government that's respectful of all of its people. And so I think that relationship is going to endure. I think it's important for both countries that it does.
Congressman, this is a tweet from Jawad Zarif, Iran's foreign minister, and I'm going to read it. I just saw it and I wrote it here. Gravely concerned about Afghanistan. Defeated foreigners must leave and fratricide must end, especially as foreigners can exploit the situation, bringing renewed bloodshed. Iran is prepared to work with Afghan government and parties, as well as neighbors, to forge last end to violence. Your thoughts on that?
Well, Iran's role in the Afghan conflict has been to supply some of the explosives that have been used to kill innocent civilians driving down the street. So they have not been a constructive player in this conflict. It's certainly the Iranian interest to see U.S. troops leave anywhere in their neighborhood. So I don't think they're looking out for Afghan interests, they're simply looking out for their own interests. But at the end of the day, I think a successful outcome in Afghanistan is one in which all the Afghan people are able to participate in their government, in which there's a nationwide ceasefire, in which the rights of women and girls are respected. And I look forward to the day when there is no necessity of having foreign troops in Afghanistan. But that will also necessitate a day in which the Taliban stop using violence as a political tool.
Is there anything else that you would like to add?
Only that, having been to Afghanistan many times, I'm acutely conscious not only of the sacrifice of American men and women, but also the tremendous sacrifice of the Afghan people, how many Afghan lives have been lost in this seemingly endless conflict, how brave the Afghan soldiers and police are, and how much I hope and pray for a final and peaceful resolution of this conflict.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.